So in the last video, I talked about what evolution is, what the definition of evolution was. We're going to go mostly with the definition of microevolution, which again, remember, is change in allele frequencies over time. And for the second video in this topic, I'm going to talk about the mechanisms of evolution, and that's basically how do we get changes in allele frequencies over time. So again, we are talking about microevolution, generation to generation change in frequencies of alleles within a population. And microevolution is evolution on a small scale, but I do want you to remember that microevolution occurring over thousands or millions of years can cause macroevolution, or the arising of new species. We're going to spend the next couple of videos talking about the mechanisms of microevolution. How can we get these changes in allele frequencies from one generation to the next? We're going to talk about natural selection and sexual selection, but we're going to talk about those specifically in topic 3 because those are sort of larger topics, and they deserve their own topic within the module. So we're going to be focusing on sort of the less mentioned mechanisms of microevolution in this PowerPoint. But the 5 mechanisms of microevolution are natural selection, sexual selection, mutation, genetic drift, and gene flow. So what we're going to do is, in this video, we're just going to spend some time talking about mutation and gene flow. As I said, we're going to skip over these two. Mutation, gene flow, and genetic drift are going to be the ones that are going to be included in this evolution topic. This is basically just the same 5 agents of evolutionary change, or 5 mechanisms of microevolution. Mutation, gene flow, which is also caused by migration, sexual selection, natural selection, and genetic drift. So these are the definitions of some of these terms that you'll need to know. What is mutation? That is a random change in an allele, and so it's a genetic issue, and mostly it's really a genetic mistake. It's a random change caused by a mistake that typically occurs during replication of your DNA. Gene flow is when individuals of one population move into the neighboring population, and they can bring in new alleles with them. And genetic drift, this one's more complicated, so we're going to spend a little bit of extra time on this. Genetic drift is random fluctuations in alleles based on sampling errors, and it typically happens in small populations. You're going to have a lab on this, so hopefully by the end of this module you'll understand genetic drift pretty well. Okay, so first we're going to talk about mutations. How do mutations cause evolution? Well, mutations, as I said before, are random. They're random changes in DNA. So this is a chromosome, and this is just showing you where a mutation might occur on a chromosome. And it affects a single gene, and it can basically change the allele. So it makes a new version of a particular gene. So it either adds, basically creates a new allele. So those new alleles can be problematic, they can be neutral, or they can actually have positive effects. So this is not a real photo, but you can imagine that if there was a mutation that caused a giraffe to lose the back half of its body, that individual wouldn't survive. So mutations can't really happen that would create an organism that looks like this. They can create organisms that look like this, though. So this is a frog that actually has extra sets of eyes, and that frog survived. It's not a beneficial mutation. That frog probably didn't pass on too many offspring, but they can potentially survive. So there are different types of mutations, and it doesn't really matter what these different types of mutations are, but why does a mutation matter? A mutation matters if we are just looking at the different base pairs in DNA, which you may or may not know anything about, and that's okay. But these could be different base pairs in DNA, and if you get just a mistake where this set of base pairs, CTT, gets changed because of a copying error to CAT, then what that means is the DNA is going to actually code for a totally different amino acid, which is part of a protein. So a single change in a single nucleotide in a DNA strand can change normal hemoglobin, which is a really important protein in your blood, from glutamine to valine. And that could change, in this case, that single point mutation changes a person from having normal hemoglobin to having sickle cell disease, which can be really damaging and even deadly. So mutations can be very important. And in this case, this is just a single tiny copying error, which has a really big effect on the phenotype of the individual. So why do mutations matter in terms of evolution? Mutations matter because sometimes these mutations can be beneficial. A lot of times they're negative, but sometimes they can be beneficial. And for example, about 12% of all mutations in bacteria E. coli are beneficial. They allow the bacteria to reproduce more, have more offspring, or survive better. A lot of mutations occur in parts of DNA that don't code for anything. So there's a lot of mutations that are neutral. So it might change the DNA code, but that doesn't have any effect on the genes. And so they're neutral mutations, and you would not have any kind of change in the phenotype. Most mutations, if they occur within the genes, parts of the chromosomes, they would be bad. Most of them are bad if they are occurring within a specific gene. Another word for bad is deleterious. So they cause problems. Typically, though, their effect on allele and genotype frequencies is minimal. So this is the part where we're talking about evolution. How can a mutation cause evolutionary change? Obviously, if there's a single mutation, that's not going to change allele frequencies very much from one generation to the next. So that mutation itself would be a very, very minor change in terms of evolution. But the really important thing is that these mutations are the raw material for all variation. So every allele that exists because of a mutation. And that means that all of that variation is what can result in changes in allele frequencies over time. If, for example, that mutation is in some way beneficial, that could actually, over time, mean that that allele gets spread more and more and more. And that's how mutations can impact changes in allele frequencies. Because all genetic variation originally came from a mutation. So now we're going to talk about gene flow and how gene flow or migration can cause evolution. And again, we are just talking about changes in allele frequencies from one generation to the next. So gene flow and migration are sort of used synonymously. They sort of mean the same thing, but gene flow is talking about specific movements of alleles, and migration is really talking about specific movement of individuals, of organisms. But gene flow is the movement of genes or alleles from one population into another, and then those alleles get incorporated into the new population's gene pool. So over here you can see we have potentially an example of two different populations. This population is full of this allele right here. We can call this big A allele. And population 2, let's say population 2 doesn't have any big A alleles. It only has little a alleles. Well, and let's say these two populations are separated by a mountain range. If somehow a pass is created, let's say there's an earthquake or something, and it creates a spot where individuals can move back and forth, then you can see that individuals of this population over here that all have the big A, if some of them move into this population over here, and again, these have to be the same species. They're the same species, but the populations are slightly different from one another. If individuals from population 1 can move into this area where population 2 is and start interacting and interbreeding, then you can see that they carry some alleles with them, and those can get incorporated into this second population. So if individuals bring alleles with them, then clearly the genetic makeup, the allelic makeup and frequency of alleles in population 2 changes from one generation to the next. So that's how gene flow or migration can cause microevolution.